How do the average Americans live in the 1960s? In the good old days, family values were the bee's knees. The average Joe or Jane would tie the knot and pop out some kiddos in their early 20s. Ladies usually focused on raising their kids instead of hitting up college or a career. A typical household consisted of a hard-working dad, a stay-at-home mom, and a bunch of rugrats running around. At the start of the decade, divorce rates were pretty low. Only around 23% of marriages ended in divorce. But by the end of the decade, that number had gone up to about 35%. In the latter half of the 1960s, more young women began to challenge the traditional role of a stay-at-home mother. Many women were attending college and entering the workforce, often out of necessity because of rising costs of living. This marked a significant shift in societal norms and expectations surrounding gender roles during this time period. In the 60s, people were making an average of $5,315 a year. But by 1969 that number had jumped up to $8,540. However, the amount of money you earned depended on your gender. If you were a woman, you may have been paid less than a man for doing the same work. Back then, minimum wage was around $1 an hour in 1960, and increased to $2 by 1969. In the 60s, a brand new house would cost you around $12,700, but by 1969 it had gone up to $15,500. Of course, the actual price would depend on many factors, like how fancy the house was and where it was located. In the groovy 1960s, a brand new car would set you back around $2,600. Fast forward to the 1969, and the cost had gone up to $3,270. Of course, these prices could vary depending on what kind of wheels you were rolling in. Gas for this car would have cost around 25 cents per gallon in the 60s, but by 1969, it would have been closer to 35 cents. Back in the 60s, a loaf of bread might have set you back about 20 cents, while a dozen eggs would go for around 50 cents. You could even buy an oven-ready turkey for just 39 cents per pound. A gallon of milk would cost around 95 cents. In the 60s, families in America spent more time on leisure activities. Television became the most popular form of entertainment, and families watched it together. Shows were created to cater to different interests within the family. Western shows were all the rage on television. Gunsmoke, Bonanza, Rawhide, and Wagon Train were among the most popular shows of the time. Gunsmoke and Bonanza were huge hits during the 60s, consistently ranking in the top 10 for viewership. And who could forget the classic sitcoms of the era? The Andy Griffith Show, My Three Sons, The Dick Van Dyke Show, and the Beverly Hillbillies were all beloved by families across America. Meanwhile, shows such as Star Trek, Batman, Mission Impossible, and Lost in Space attempted to attract younger viewers. Many of these programs have had a lasting cultural impact, which is still felt today. In the 1960s, Americans were big fans of going to the movies. The top-grossing film of the decade was The Sound of Music, which starred Julie Andrews. Andrews also captivated audiences in her leading role in Mary Poppins. Audrey Hepburn was a megastar back in the day, with iconic roles in classic films such as My Fair Lady and Breakfast at Tiffany's. John Wayne was still a hit during this time, starring in popular films like The Longest Day, The Sons of Katie Elder, El Dorado, and True Grit. Clint Eastwood rose to fame as a leading man in classic westerns, such as A Fistful of Dollars, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Sean Connery was the legendary actor who brought James Bond to life on the big screen in iconic films like Dr. No, Goldfinger, Thunderball, and more. His portrayal of the British spy captivated audiences around the world and helped make James Bond one of the most enduring fictional characters of all time. Baseball has always been known as America's national pastime, and the sport was extremely popular in the 1960s. In 1961, Americans were captivated by the epic battle between Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris to break Babe Ruth's record of 60 home runs in a single season. Maris emerged victorious, smashing an astonishing 61 home runs. Other big names that ruled the baseball scene in the 60s were legends like Frank Robinson, Willie Mays, and Hank Aaron. In the 1960s, the NBA was home to some of the greatest players of all time. Coach Red Auerbach led the Boston Celtics to an impressive 9 NBA championships, with Bill Russell as their star player who won the Most Valuable Player award 4 times. The biggest baller of the decade was Wilt Chamberlain, who also snagged 4 MVP awards, shot the rock best in the league 7 times, and pulled down the most boards 8 times. The music scene in the 1960s was crazy diverse. You had bands from across the pond, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, making their way to America. The Fab Four made their debut in '63, and quickly became the biggest thing in music. By the end of the decade, they had a whopping 19 chart-topping hits. Women started rocking pants more often, and skirts got even shorter with the introduction of the miniskirt in '64. Later on, bell-bottom jeans, tie-dye shirts, and paisley prints became all the rage. Men let their hair grow longer than ever before, while women opted for shorter hairstyles. It's worth noting that not every family experienced the 1960s.